Right. So, hello everyone. We are in for this week, which is second to last week of January, for our next video that we're going to go ahead and cover here for the new year. And this topic fits more into a line that I haven't really dug a whole lot into in terms of I've kind of realized most of my history videos kind of delve within the past 400 to 500 year range, but they very seldom go beyond that. Well, the one that we are going to do today delves a little further back than that, which fits that prerogative. And at the same time, it's also a topic that some people, at least in some regard, have knowledge of. While at the same time, it's not something that's really remembered much today by a majority of the population. And that would be of the Crusades. And the Crusades, for those of you who are not aware of what the Crusades were, it was a series of essentially religious wars fought over who was going to control the area that is Palestine / Israel / the Holy Land, whatever you want to call it. That whole area for roughly almost 3 centuries was fought over between the Christian Europeans in the West and even in the East. So we'll say the Christians of Europe and the Muslims of the Islamic Empires in the Middle East and the Caliphates. So you have, of course, this clash of two big ideologies coming together. And this is also something we might also investigate a little further later this year, is kind of the clash that ends up coming about. Firstly, how do Islam and Christianity first come to their first major conflict with each other, because that in itself is also a significant story in history, is where these two religions for the first time end up clashing. So that may be a topic we discuss later in the year or later on. So for today, we're going to cover the Crusades. So for the time period here, officially we're covering from about 1096 until 1271, but that you could also argue they went on until roughly around 1300 or so. But the future events as the Crusades kind of went on, most of them were not officially sponsored. They were more individual nations trying to launch ill-fated attempts, and they were nowhere near as successful or notorious, I should say, as the first four. The first four are really the big ones. So by the end of the 11th century, so this is the 1000s, in case there are some of you out there who have difficulty remembering when we're talking about the centuries, what particular century we're talking about, because I know it's sometimes odd, given the factor that right now the starting number of our year is 20, but yet we're in the 21st. And sometimes that does confuse people. So by the end of the 11th century, Western Europe had emerged as a significant power in the world. Now, mind you, before this, Europe had been largely in what we call the Dark Ages. Now, whether or not they were so dark is another question, because there is that continuing debate as to whether or not it was really all that bad, or if there really was that much culture and stuff lost. But for technical purpose, we're going to refer to it as the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages had been that period of time at least in Western Europe, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 until roughly around, I would say, until about the 9th or 10th century, somewhere in there, is where it would officially come to an end. And Europe actually starts to Western Europe at least starts to solidify, because the eastern part of Europe was still very much under the control of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, but they always referred to themselves as Romans. So Eastern Europe never really went through a dark age. It was more Western Europe, where the Western Roman Empire had collapsed and all these Gothic tribes and Germanic tribes had moved into the power vacuum that had now occupied Western Europe and just started settling down. So by the 11th century, Western Europe is starting to get its things together. It's starting to come together. I mean, by the end of the 11th century, England is now undergoing a major change because of the invasion of the Normans by William the Conqueror in 1066, which that's another thing we could also discuss, which is going to set England onto the path becoming one of the major European powers in the West, in the Western European theater. Before that, it was very much the Franks in the West Francia, which of course would have been the eventual French. So Western Europe is emerging as a significant power. However, it is still lagging behind the Mediterranean civilizations that surround the Mediterranean Sea, and such as the Byzantine Empire, which we already mentioned, and the Islamic empires that are already set up in North Africa, which technically I think we could call them caliphates. Now, Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, had lost, unfortunately, despite it being still prominent in Eastern Europe, it had lost much of its territory in Asia Minor, which is what we would call the country of Turkey, so we'll refer to it as Turkey. They had lost much of their territory in Asia Minor to the invading Seljuk Turks, who are coming in from the Middle East, and they're trying to settle Anatolia/Turkey. They're trying to settle that area and take it away from Byzantine control. And by the 1081, they had largely succeeded in doing just that. And in 1081, the Byzantine general Alexios Komnenos, or I don't know how to pronounce that last name fully, but we're going to say Komnenos, he takes control as Emperor Alexios I. And in 1095, the Emperor Alexios of the Byzantines, he sends envoys to the head of the Catholic Church in Rome. Now, who would that be? That, of course, would be the Pope. He sends envoys to the Pope Urban II, asking for mercenary troops from the West to help confront the Turks. So this is a striking break from the previous centuries, because as we may know, Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Western Catholic Christianity had actually split at this point, and relations between the two weren't that great for centuries after the split, after the Great Schism. This is a significant breakthrough because now the Eastern Orthodox Church is essentially asking the Western Europe, the Catholics, who they're, arguing over religion on, they're essentially asking them for help, saying, let's just disregard our differences right now, and can you come help us with these Islamic, Turks that are coming in and actually help us oust them? And so this also came at a time when those relations are slightly improving, but it's still a very big jump that they are willing to collaborate and actually cooperate with each other on this. In November of 1095, Pope Urban II called on Western Christians at the Council of Clermont in France. He called on Western Christians to take up arms to aid the Byzantines and recapture the Holy Land from the Muslim invaders, is what he called them. So in 1095, the Pope essentially puts out this call that if you are a Christian and you're in Western Europe and you consider yourself a follower of God and the Lord, you should come with us and launch a crusade to retake the Holy Land, retake the land of David, retake the land of Jesus, the Israel, and go take all that back for Christendom. We need to oust these pagan invaders, because in many ways, Islam made Christians afraid because it was so different from what they were used to, and in many ways it was blasphemous to them to propose that there was another prophet after Jesus, and that was, of course, the Muslim prophet of Muhammad, who founded Islam. To Christians, and even today, it's still hard for many of them to grasp the tenets of Islamic religion. And it was just the same back then, except back then they're willing to go to war over it because they think that the only answer to this is they must be killed. Now, the Pope's plea was greeted tremendously in not just a couple hundred, not just a couple thousand, but we're talking tens of thousands of Western Europeans responded to the Pope's plea to go on these crusades, and they said, yep, we're going to the Holy Land. We want glory, we want riches, we want to do our Christian duty. So tens of thousands of Western Europeans respond to the Pope Urban II's plea and get ready to actually march to the Holy Land at the aid of the Byzantines. This includes both the military elite of the nations that they are in the kingdoms, and even ordinary citizens who deem it just their Christian duty to go. Many of them would wear crosses as a symbol of the church. And several religious knightly orders were even founded, specifically for the purpose of defending the Holy Land and to protect Christian pilgrims who were traveling to and from there. And among these are very famous knightly orders such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, and the Hospitallers. This brings us to the outbreak in 1096 of the official First Crusade, and this is where it all starts. And the First Crusade is going to be until about 1099. So four armies comprise the First Crusade primarily, and the four armies of Crusaders were formed from troops of different Western European regions. These were led by Raymond of St. Gilles, Godfrey of Bouillon, Hugh of Vermandois, and Bohemond of Taranto. The four armies departed for the Byzantine Empire, departed specifically for the Byzantine capital of Constantinople in August of 1096. There was a fifth army of Crusaders that was also organized of knights and commoners that was set out, and this was known as the People's Crusade, and it was led by kind of a mysterious preacher figure known as Peter the Hermit. We don't know a whole lot about him, but it was made up of more common citizens and common, lower class people who wanted to go, and not the military elite that were actually organized by, nobles or kings or stuff like that. Now, when Peter the Hermit's Crusader army got to the when they got to Asia Minor, to Turkey, around in the Byzantine Empire, they actually ignored Emperor Alexios's advice that they should wait for the other four armies of Crusaders before continuing on. That we should, you should wait till we're all here, then we'll all go in together. We'll have a best chance at actually ousting these Turks from Anatolia. Well, Peter's Crusaders say, no, we want to go at it alone. We want the glory and the riches and, everything that comes with it for ourselves. This ends up being a major miscalculation. In August, they ended up crossing the Bosphorus Strait into Anatolia, and the first clash of the Crusades between the Crusaders and the Turks ended up being the crushing of the People's Crusade by the Turks at the Battle of Seboltus. So Peter's army crosses the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus Straits, goes into Anatolia, despite the Byzantine Emperor telling them that's probably not the best idea, and they get utterly trounced as a result. At the very start, they get trounced by the Turks. It's not even a half-wit victory. It's an absolute just annihilation. Now, there was another Crusader group that was established in Europe that was led by Count Emico, and they carried out a series of massacres of Jews back in the Rhineland, back in what is now Germany. So they never even got to the Holy Land. They decide, oh yeah, we're going to go to the Holy Land and we're going to, respond to the Pope's call, only to turn their attention toward Jews, who they accused of all kinds of things back then, because to many Christians at the time, Jews were no better than Muslims in many ways, because some Christians deemed that Jews were the whole reason that Jesus died. Now, that's not in any way true. That's not in any way a viable thing to argue violence against Jewish people. There should be no violence against Jewish people. They are just another religion as in any other. Anti-Semitism is actually sickening and utterly distasteful and should not even exist, as many other forms of bias and discrimination are. But back then, instead of going and doing what they set out to do, they decided we're just going to massacre a bunch of Jews in the Rhineland. This damaged relations between the Crusaders who were still heading to the Holy Land and the Jews who are still living in the Holy Land, because now they're going to be less likely to want to help the Crusaders, because they're like, okay, you want us to aid you kick these Muslims out, but at the same time, you just massacred a whole bunch of our fellow members up in, the Holy Roman Empire. Why would we help you? You're obviously not any more placating to us than you are to the Muslims. So a possible ally that they could have had at the very start in these crusades, because of Count Emico's People's Crusade that he has up in the Rhineland against Jewish people, he ends up damaging any potentiality for an alliance between the Jews that are living in Palestine and the Christian Crusaders who are coming there. Now, upon the arrival of the four armies in Constantinople, Alexios insisted that each of the commanders of the four armies should take an oath of loyalty to him and recognize his authority over any territory that was regained from the Turks or conquered that hadn't been previously under Turkish control. Every one of the four commanders, with the exception of Bohemond, refused to take that oath. They saw this as an attempt by by what was essentially the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, who they didn't already believe was fully adherent to Christianity because they thought it was heretic, and the Eastern Orthodox thought the same of the Catholics. But they saw this as just another power grab by the Eastern Orthodox Church to try to exert control over a Christian expedition that had been organized in large part by the head of the Western Church, the Pope. So everyone except Bohemond refused to take that oath of loyalty and the oath of recognition that any territory that they regain or conquer automatically belongs to the Byzantines and Emperor Alexios. In May of 1097, the Crusaders and the Byzantines attacked Nicaea, which is now the modern-day city of Iznik, Turkey, and which was also the Seljuk capital at the time, and by late June the city had surrendered. So this essentially kicked out the Seljuks out of a large portion of the land that they had taken from the Byzantines beforehand, and achieved the initial goal of what Emperor Alexios had sent the envoys to the Pope for. That was simply the regaining of Byzantine lands from the Seljuk Turks and forcing them back. Alexios had no inclinations to go for deeper into what was the Holy Land. He didn't have any inclinations to go into like Palestine and all that. That's not what he wanted. He did not want to go into Palestine and gain the Holy Land that in many ways the Byzantines hadn't controlled for a couple centuries at that point. He didn't have any inclination of that. However, the Crusaders who have come to aid him do have that inclination, and they're going to do it regardless. Despite the deteriorating relations with the Byzantine leaders, and the combined force continued marching through Anatolia and started marching south into Syria, just north of Palestine. They ended up capturing the Syrian city of Antioch in June of 1098, and the struggles that would then ensue over who properly controlled the city, because of course, Emperor Alexios, since his troops are involved, claims that the city is part of Byzantine territory now, while the Crusaders argue that no, we never agree to your loyalty oath except Bohemond, so in all technicality, you do not have sovereignty over this territory that we just conquered. The Crusaders began a march to Jerusalem, which was then occupied by the Egyptian Fatimids. The Fatimids were not even the Seljuk Turks. So Jerusalem, who they're going after, isn't even under the control of the Turks, who they were initially called for to fight. This is under an entirely different dynasty that hasn't even been involved in the war, and in many aspects could have been an ally to them, because the Fatimids in Egypt were Shiite Muslims, whereas the Seljuks were Sunni Muslims, which that's the two different branches of Islam that commonly quarrel with each other because they argue over who was Muhammad's proper successor. Today, that is a main reason why Saudi Arabia and Iran do not get along with each other at all, because Saudi Arabia is Sunnis. A majority of Muslims today are Sunni Muslims. A majority of the Islamic faith is Sunni. There's a minority that is Shiite, and the most pronounced Shiite population of Muslims is in Iran. There are also some in Iraq, but it is mostly Iran that harbors the most. And because of that difference, in all technicality, the Fatimids were actually an enemy to the Seljuk Turks just as much as the Crusaders were. But now they're getting attacked by the Crusaders, who are dead set on conquering Palestine. In June of 1099, the Crusaders encamped around Jerusalem, and by July, the city's governor had surrendered. Despite a promise of protection from the Crusaders that upon their surrender, we're not going to harm anyone inside the city, just surrender your city and we'll come in and occupy it peacefully. Despite the Crusaders promising that, as soon as the gates to Jerusalem are open to the Crusaders' army, they go in and slaughter hundreds of men, women, and children upon their entrance. So the Crusaders, who are supposed to be good Christians, just went back on their word. They offered a promise of protection that they would not do any harm to the inhabitants of the city upon its surrender, only once the gates are open and they're let inside, they go on a killing spree. Nice. Aren't Christians wonderful nowadays? So here is a map of southeastern Europe just before the First Crusade broke out. So this is more to show what land it was that the Seljuk Turks had. This was the primary goal of the First Crusade, was to get back the land from the Seljuk Turks. Here is the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire. This is what's left of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Here's their capital, Constantinople. At one time, they still had control of all of Anatolia here, what is now Turkey. All this green is what the Seljuk Turks have taken away from the Byzantines, and it is this land, initially. This is the initial target, to regain this. Not down here, where Israel is in Palestine, but up here. This is what they want initially. And they accomplish that, but then they decide, well, we're not going to stop here. We're going to go ahead and we're going to march down here. And then here is a little illustration from an old medieval drawing of what Peter the Hermit and his crusaders marching into the Holy Land might have looked like. Of course, this is not an actual depiction, but this is an artist's impression from the time. Of course, we don't really know much about Peter the Hermit. We just know he was a preacher. His crusaders were largely ordinary people with a couple of knights mixed in. But this was the crusaders that were the first to march into Anatolia, but they were also the first ones to get utterly destroyed during the First Crusade. So, with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, in June of 1099, the First Crusade was over. And having achieved the goals in a very short time during the First Crusade, many of the Crusaders decided, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go back home. We've accomplished what we set out to do and more. We've gotten the Anatolia back for the Byzantines from the Seljuk Turks, and we've even managed to conquer the Holy Land and take back the holy city of Jerusalem. So many of them decide to go home, but not all of them do. And for those that do decide to remain, the remaining Crusaders established 4 Western settlements / Crusader states to help protect the newly conquered lands that they had taken from the Fatimids and the Seljuk Turks. And these 4 Crusader states were the states of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli. Which the other ones, I believe, Jerusalem was a kingdom, Tripoli and Edessa were counties, and Antioch was a principality. And here is a map of what those Crusader states looked like. So right here, Jerusalem is ideally, of course, the capital of the newly founded Crusader state of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. You have the county of Tripoli, which is up here. Then we have the Principality of Antioch. And way up here in the north is the county of Edessa. These are your 4 Crusader states that are now set up to guard the lands that have been gained during the Crusades and guard the grand prize of Jerusalem right there. Now, the Crusader states were guarded. They were not simply, established states with no kind of defense. They were guarded specifically with all kinds of fortresses and castles that were built by many of the militant knightly orders that remain there, especially the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights and the Knights Hospitaller. They all built these massive fortresses that were meant to act as defenses for these newly established Crusader states. And the Crusader states were going to retain the upper hand after the First Crusade up until around 1130. And that is when the Muslims began gaining ground in their jihad against the Christians. Of course, this had been declared after the Christians had invaded them. And for those of you who are not aware, a jihad is the Muslim word for holy war. It means holy war in their religion. So they would declare these people are an enemy to our faith, they're a contradictory to our faith, and we must eradicate them. So by 1130, the Crusader states' upper hand starts to run out, because at this point, now the Muslims of the Islamic empires are in caliphates are actually starting to gain the upper hand in battle. In 1144, the Seljuk general Zanji, who was the governor of Mosul, which is now, I believe, in Iraq, Mosul. So he was the governor of Mosul. He captured Edessa, which was the northernmost Crusader state. So in 1144, Zanji comes in from Iraq, which would be over here, and he captures and utterly destroys the county of Edessa. So this state, gone. The far northern Crusader state is now gone in 1144. The news of Edessa's fall stunned the rest of Western Europe, who, after almost 40 years, decided, all right, now the Muslims are on the move again, so guess what we're doing? We're going on another crusade. We must defend our Christian brothers, even though they're there illegally. So 1144, when this happens, the news of it reaches Europe. The Western European countries panic that this is going to mean that the other Crusader states will soon fall as well, and it leads to the Christian authorities in the West, including the Pope, calling for a second crusade to take place. And this one ends up being organized by King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany, and they will lead this crusade out toward the Holy Land in 1147 to start out. So in October of 1147, the Turks ended up actually destroying King Conrad of Germany's forces at Dorylaeum, which was the site of a great Christian victory during the First Crusade. So the Second Crusade is already starkly different from the first. Whereas the first was very much a Christian victory from the start, the second starts off pretty much from the very beginning until the end. It's a Muslim trouncing of Christians. The Islamic empires actually have gotten a good attack strategy together this time and are able to actually resist the invading Western Europeans that are coming to try to oust them out of those lands. Louis and Conrad had assembled their armies in Jerusalem and then decided to attack the Syrian stronghold of Damascus, which of course Damascus still exists to this day, with an army of 50,000 strong, which was the largest army mustered in the field in the Crusades up to that point. Damascus's ruler called upon Zanji's successor, Nur al-Din, for aid, knowing that he could not defend the city on his own, so he appeals to the successor of the man that conquered Edessa and says, hey, could you come help me? I need the help. So Nur al-Din goes in and he decides, all right, we're going to come to the aid of Damascus. And it works. The combined Muslim force decisively ended the Second Crusade by defeating the Crusaders, and Nur al-Din ended up adding Damascus to his growing empire in 1154, which brought an end to the Second Crusade. So the Second Crusade, very short, but very quickly it turns from a repeat of 1099 from a Christian victory into this Muslim routing of the invading Crusaders. It fails utterly. That brings us to the events of what will become the Third Crusade, which is perhaps the most famous of the Crusades for the figures who took part. And the Third Crusade is going to start in about 1187, but we have a little bit to discuss just before that. And so, after the end of the Second Crusade, the Crusaders launched multiple attacks from Jerusalem to try to capture Egypt and kind of wipe out the Fatimid Caliphate that was there, and they saw as a threat to their sovereignty and as a threat to their continued existence. Nur al-Din's forces, who were led by General Shirkuh and his nephew Saladin, they seized Cairo in 1169 and forced the Crusaders to evacuate the city of what is now the capital of Egypt. So for a time, the Crusaders from the Kingdom of Jerusalem ended up actually pushing into Egypt and got as far as Cairo on the Nile. But unfortunately for them, the Fatimid forces under Generals Shirkuh and his nephew Saladin are going to end up pushing them right back out. And by 1169, they have managed to achieve that. Upon Shirkuh's death, his nephew, Saladin, or Saladin, however you want to say it, I say Saladin, but Saladin ended up assuming control of the Fatimids' army in Egypt, and he begins a conquest campaign to strike back at these Crusader states that have long been interfering in the Fatimids' regional power. This accelerated after Nur al-Din's death in 1174. So once his uncle is dead and his ruler is dead, Saladin kind of becomes ruler on his own, and he ends up embarking on this campaign of conquest to retake all of the Crusader states that have been robbed from us for almost 100 years at this point. And at the Battle of Hattin, well, that's a little jumpy. In 1187, Saladin started his major campaign against the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and that was when he ended up engaging in the Battle of Hattin. Saladin ends up winning the Battle of Hattin against a large Christian army, and the Battle of Hattin's victory for him ends up allowing him and his army to take control of Jerusalem for the first time since 1099. So Saladin's army ends up, well, here's a better map. I have a better one on me. So his victory, this is a map of what it's going to look like after the Battle of Hattin, what the Middle East is going to look like now after this battle. Saladin comes up from Egypt, where he is, of course, the main ruler of the Fatimid Caliphate, and he comes up and defeats them here at Hattin, which is near Acre, and this destroys the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is gone, and at this point, there's only two remaining Crusader states that are primarily left, and that is the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli are still left. With Jerusalem conquered, that's all gone. So Saladin has managed to take back the Holy City in 1187 after the Battle of Hattin, and the outrage over Saladin's victories inspires a third crusade, which is led by three rulers. We have Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who, unfortunately, on his way to the Holy Land, he ended up drowning with his army in Syria, so he never even got to reach the Holy Land, and he was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And then you have King Philip II of France and King Richard I of England, who was also given the nickname of Richard the Lionheart for his courageous bravery during the war, well, during the Crusade. And this is an image of King Richard leading his army of Crusaders toward Jerusalem. It's a painting of it. In fact, during Richard's he ruled England from officially from 1189 until 1199, and for almost his entire 10-year reign, he barely spent any of that back home in England. Most of it was spent like in the Crusades or as a captive of in Germany. He very little actually got to rule at home. So the Third Crusade starts officially in 1187. And in September of 1191, Richard's forces end up defeating Saladin's in the Battle of Arsuf. And this is the only major battle of the Third Crusade, because the Battle of Hattin technically happened before it was officially declared, and it's really the only major battle of it. And this leads to the recapture of the city of Jaffa, and from that recaptured city, Richard then reestablished Christian control over some of the region and approached Jerusalem. However, due to Jerusalem's importance and significance to both the Christians and to the Muslims, he refused to lay siege to the city and risk destroying large portions of it, because it was the holy city. He didn't want to be seen as the person that made it a ruin. So in September 1192, Richard and Saladin sign a peace treaty. They come to a common agreement. This reestablished the Kingdom of Jerusalem, however, this time it would not include Jerusalem within the kingdom, and ended the Third Crusade. So the Third Crusade is probably the most well-known because you have figures like Richard the Lionheart, you have Saladin, you have the Battle of Hattin, and all that. It's probably the most well-known, but it's also not very long. In terms of part of the longevity from 1187 to 1192 is simply the fact that it took a while for your troops to get all the way from England or France down to Israel. It took quite a while before they finally got there. And that leads us fast forward to about 10 years, and we come to the ill-fated Fourth Crusade. And despite Pope Innocent III calling for a new crusade in 1198, power struggles within Europe and the Byzantine Empire ended up kind of driving the Crusaders, instead of going to Israel, they diverted their mission in 1198 to topple the reigning Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, which was Emperor Alexios III. Alexios III was bickering with the Crusaders on many parts. He, of course, insisted, that I want control of these lands, and the common usual disagreements between the two, to the point that they viewed him as an enemy and an impediment to future crusades to the Holy Land, and then we need to get someone in there who is more admissible to us. And Alexios III's nephew, who would become Alexios IV, he ended up being just the right ally for them at the time. He very much he made a deal with the Crusaders that he would support them in any way as long as they supported, overthrowing his uncle and making sure he gets on the throne. So in 1203, the Crusaders intervene in Constantinople and they overthrow the reigning Byzantine emperor in favor of his nephew Alexios IV, who also promised them large sums of money. Unfortunately for the newly crowned Emperor Alexios IV, he is not very popular among his actual subjects, and he meets a lot of heavy resistance as he tries to submit the Byzantine Church to that of the one in Rome, to the Catholic Church. It does not sit over well with his subjects. Eventually, in 1204, Alexios IV, just a year into his reign, ended up being strangled to death in a palace coup. And this turns what is supposed to be a fourth crusade to the Holy Land into an absolute disaster, because now the Crusaders who just helped Alexios get onto his throne are utterly mad that he's just been overthrown, and they turn their anger and attention toward the Byzantines who just overthrew him. So in 1204, the Crusaders declared war on Constantinople, and they end up ending the Fourth Crusade in 1204 with the sack of Constantinople. They get inside, massacre hundreds of men, women, and children. They burn the city. They loot and ransack it to near destruction. The walled city that had stood and not been able to be conquered for almost 1,000 years at that point, was finally broken into and ransacked by none other than fellow Christians, who simply because of our disagreement decided they were going to utterly attack and ransack the city. As a response, the Byzantine Empire was then tried to be placed directly under the control of the Catholic Church, and they kind of broke it up into all these different kingdoms and principalities. Eventually, it would reform about 100 years later and coalesce back into its former self, but it was very much weakened after 1204. It would not be long before, eventually, in 1453, the Ottoman Turks would utterly destroy what was left. But 1204 marked one of the final downfalls of the Byzantine Empire. And this is a look of what it looked like after the disastrous Fourth Crusade, where they decided that instead of going to the Holy Land, we're going to go to Constantinople and we're going to attack the Byzantines. We're going to break up their empire and make sure that they cannot be an impediment to any future actions in the region. And that is where a majority of the Byzantine Empire ends up becoming what they call the Latin Empire. It was supposed to be under the direct control of the Pope, but many of the native Greeks and native subjects were not willing to submit to Catholic authority after they were Eastern Orthodox, and that is part of the reason why eventually these were overthrown and the Byzantines recoalesced back into an empire. You also had the Principality of Achaea, the Duchy of the Archipelago, the Duchy of Athens. It's just an absolute mess after this point. Your possible strongest ally in the region that you could have had, and you just literally smashed them to bits. And the Fourth Crusade was really the last, I would say, major attempt to go to the Holy Land, because that brings us to the final few, and they weren't really so much attempts in many parts. During the rest of the 13th century, a variety of crusades would aim not to topple the Muslim forces in the Holy Land, but to combat any and all groups who were seen as enemies to Christianity. Some of the examples of this would be the Albigensian Crusade, was from 1208 to 1229. This occurred in France and was aimed to root out the heretical Cathari Albigensian sect of Christianity that was within the country. Another one was what we call the Baltic Crusades from 1211 to 1225, which sought to subdue pagans in Transylvania. And in 1212, a so-called Children's Crusade, this was kind of an odd one, occurred as thousands of young children across Europe vowed that they were going to march to Jerusalem. However, it's not typically regarded as a crusade because it never even reached the Holy Land, and it was made out. And there's also questions of whether or not it really actually was comprised out of children entirely. Not to say that there weren't children in it, but it's not really considered to be a true crusade as it never even got to the Holy Land or engaged in any kind of battle or war or any kind of thing of conquest. But it's just an odd thing out there from it. And before his death in 1216, Pope Innocent III, who had called for the Fourth Crusade, he began what was called, he made sure that before he died, the Fifth Crusade began, what was called the Fifth Crusade. In this one, the Crusaders would attack Egypt by land and sea, but they were then forced to surrender to none other than Saladin's nephew, which was Al-Malik al-Kamil, in 1221. So the Fifth Crusade, which was aimed directly at attacking Egypt, ended up absolutely failing from this get-go. In 1229, a sixth crusade was begun under Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, but this achieved the peaceful transfer of Jerusalem to Crusader control through negotiating with Al-Kamil, who was, again, the nephew of Saladin. So this one is slightly successful. They do regain control of Jerusalem for about a decade, because that is how long the treaty ends up lasting. Within a decade, the treaty between Al-Kamil and the Crusaders had expired, and the Muslims then regained control. King Louis IX of France then organized a seventh crusade in 1248 against Egypt again, just like the fifth, but this also ended up being an absolute failure and had failed by 1254. So the last couple of crusades after the fourth crusade really weren't really any way profitable except for the Sixth Crusade. I mean, it did regain Christian control for about 10 years. Which brings us to the Mamluks. But before we do, I'm going to show this the last image we have here. As we mentioned, the Knights Hospitallers, the Knights Templar, and the Teutonic Knights, they all built these big old castled fortresses in the Crusader states to try to up their defense of these Crusader gained lands. And this is one of the Knights Hospitaller castles and fortresses, and still standing today in Syria. Many of them actually still stand, and they were among the first to use arches in a new magnificent way of which they were able to support a building to new heights. And many of them are World Heritage sites that are left. So the Crusaders soon were confronted, or what was left of the Crusaders, were soon confronted with a new Muslim dynasty in Egypt. The Fatimids were ousted from power in Egypt, and instead their place in power in Egypt was taken over by the Mamluks. The Mamluks were descended from former slaves of the Islamic Empire. And in 1260, and the Mamluks would actually rule Egypt, I believe, until roughly the 1700s. So they were going to rule up until almost modern times. And in 1260, the Mamluk forces in Palestine ended up halting the advance of the Mongols, who were coming into Europe at that point, in Africa. So they end up halting the advance of the Mongols, who had already stormed across Asia. And under the ruthless Sultan Babyars, the Mamluks then demolished Antioch, finally in 1268, which was one of the last remaining Crusader states that had remained. Antioch was that one up in Syria. And Louis IX then organized an Eighth Crusade in response to that in 1270. However, his initial goal to aid the remaining Crusader states in Syria fell apart after he ended up dying on the way. The last significant crusade in any form that took place after the ascension of the Mamluks into power was a small expedition that was led by King Edward I of England in 1272, but this was very short-lived, and in terms of what it actually accomplished was pretty much nothing. They probably marched there, and there's not even a record of any battles taking place, so it's more than likely they set out to go there and didn't even reach it. And Edward I is actually more well known for his invasions of Scotland and Ireland, and more than he is for this ill-fated Eighth Crusade that he launches. Any further attempts after 1272 to try to go to the Holy Land as a religious war largely were the actions of individual nations at that point. The popes pretty much gave up on the idea. So, in all reality, the only crusade that was very successful was the first one. I mean, the second was an absolute defeat. The third was somewhat of a victory. And the fourth was a disaster. The fifth was a disaster. The sixth was a mild victory. And then the last couple after that really weren't even anything. So that is just a basic history of going over the Crusades. Of course, nowadays are very largely forgotten. Many people actually forget that the Christians and Muslims have actually fought like multiple holy wars with each other just over Israel, over Palestine. They forget that. Many of them don't even know it today, and it's quite shocking to me how many don't realize that. But that is just, of course, a short little brief history that we wanted to go ahead and cover because it's also something that took place. It's nearing like 900 years ago now, almost 1,000 years ago. I mean, we're coming up here. Um, I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many years we're looking at here. But okay, I can find my, which of course now that I need it, I can't find it. Huh. Well, let's do that because the First Crusade started in 1097, and we are in 2024. So let's do the math here. How many years are we looking at? We're looking at probably in about another. I hate that I can't just be the one to do math off the top of my head. Yeah, we're looking at something that has occurred 927 years ago is when this all started. So that's almost 1,000 years ago is what we're coming up on. So in another, see here, I'm going to clear exactly how many years we have to that. Clear that. So in 2097 will be 1,000 years. 2024, we have 73 more years, and it's going to be 1,000 years since the first crusade was launched, which is quite shocking. But again, these are something that did happen. It's something that a lot of people, I don't think nowadays, back in the day, they were heavily talked about historical topic, but the Crusades just aren't really discussed that much anymore. They're kind of forgotten in many respects by a lot of people, unless you really delve into history and then you meet people who actually can remember these things and actually show interest in them. But that's a lot of things in history as well. So that will conclude our video for this week. So a little bit different of a topic. So again, comments, suggestions, questions, any of that stuff, go ahead and make sure that we put that in the comment section if you have any. Always feel free to take a look at anything that I have gotten or anything I've received and try to respond to it if I need to be. Moving on to next week, I'm pretty sure I know what we're going to be doing with that one, but I'm still working on that one, so we'll get to it, I guess, when we get to it. So I can't think of anything else that is major. So as always, hopefully everyone has good continued health and a good continued rest of their week. Now all the snow's gone. Now the heat's coming in, but now I'm also hearing that we're going to get another Arctic blast possibly in February, but we'll wait and see what happens. So hopefully that doesn't come too soon because we just got chilled to the bone. So hopefully everyone remains safe, everyone remains warm, and we'll see you all back here next week for our next topic video that we'll end up covering.